A couple of things. We are at the end of our series on mental health. And again, this is the end of our series, but not the end of our journey, right? We've talked a lot about that really this is the beginning of our conversation around this topic at Rhapsody, but it's the end of our formal series around it. And to cap off the series, one of the things that I was really thinking throughout the whole thing was it would be really cool to get the perspective of a professional. It would be great to hear what it's like, maybe to erase the stigma on counseling. We've talked a lot about erasing the stigma around mental health in general, but sometimes there's a stigma around counseling too, and we'll get into that. And we have a special guest today. Her name is Kristal Mathis, and she is a youth mental health specialist. And so we're going to have the chance to hear from her. We're going to have a conversation. We sat down 2 weeks ago, and we talked for quite some time just about various things around mental health. And we figured, well, there's an easy way to do this. Let's just take that conversation that we had there and just do it in front of everybody, because it was a really great conversation. So will you help me, first of all, welcome Kristal Mathis as she comes up? Yeah. It's on.
I don't use these in therapy.
You don't?
So you have to be patient.
That's good. So as I sat down with Kristal, one thing that I was aware of immediately is her compassion for people that reaches beyond really her profession, which is pretty amazing. And I think the reason why people get into, I guess, being a mental health specialist. So I guess to start out, I figure let's let them get to know you a little bit and tell us who you are and why counseling? Why was that the thing that you chose?
So I have been in the field about 12 years now, and I thought I would be a teacher. But then young people in large groups seemed a little intimidating, although ironic right now. And I had a psychology professor that was amazing about the time I knew I wasn't going to be a teacher. And I thought I would be a therapist for young children, so I picked George Fox because they have a great play therapy program. And then I realized, I really connect with teenagers. And that led me to be a youth mental health specialist. I've seen kids as young as 3, as old as 70, in their 70s, run the gamut, but teenage girls who engage in self-harm is my specialty. And I'm really passionate about family therapy because it has been so helpful in my own family. And growing up, family members had mental health issues, and I know that that's part of why I am in the field, is because it has been helpful for us, and I don't know how we would have survived without it. One thing I really appreciate about my parents, who actually are here tonight, but is that they never put a price tag on getting help. They were always like, okay, well, let's find someone who will help with this or who will help with this. And I really appreciated that commitment to helping us be better. And I'm really excited about what you're doing here at the church, because sometimes there is a stigma about mental health issues in the church around anxiety and depression, and to be able to talk about it. I was a youth leader for 6 years at a church, and that was one of my first encounters with young people with significant mental health issues. And what I found is that the church is the front line for mental health issues. You will go to your pastor before you go to anyone else if you're struggling. And a lot of times the pastors didn't know what to do. And so that's one of the things that I'm really passionate about, is just helping youth pastors and pastors in general have access to the resources they need for that.
That's awesome. I guess in continuing that conversation, what is it about counseling that is so important? Why is that such an important step in someone's journey?
It can be helpful for many reasons depending on the issue. I also see a therapist, and he sees a therapist, and I don't know where it ends. But it is, it's really helpful to have an objective person. If you talk to your friends and family, they love you so much, they're going to give you a biased perspective. And to have someone on the outside who can kind of look at the big picture and help you cope with whatever is going on, whether that's communication skills or tools, figuring out how to have better boundaries. Sometimes I just really appreciate the validation that I'm not the crazy one in the situation. I had a pastor once say that sometimes an appropriate response to life is going a little crazy, and I found that very validating. As the question was, therapy, why? As a parent, it also is really helpful if you have a young person who is struggling. I was a foster mom for 3 years and had 8 young people come through my home in that process. And it's very different living with someone with a mental health issue versus seeing it clinically, just on the other side of the table. And so it was an amazing experience. To be able to know what it's like to live with someone with ADHD, anxiety, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, depression, PTSD, of course. And so to be able to experience that, I was able to use therapists to help me through that process, as well as for them too. And I don't know if we would have survived without them. I know that God was like, okay, these people. And in that process, you might find, if you're searching for a counselor, one that is not a good fit. I had that experience about 50-50 at the time. And it was a little sad for my own profession because I wanted it to be more than that, better statistics on that. But most people are well-intended, but it doesn't mean that they know what they're doing. One of the pet peeves of mine is when a therapist will say, well, that's not my area of specialty, but, and then continue to give you their advice. I had that happen to me in a counseling session with one of the girls, and it ended up being actually opposite of what the specialists told us later. And as a mom, you really want to trust your gut instinct, or as a parent, you want to trust your gut instinct. And so if the therapist is telling you something that doesn't feel right, voice that, say that. Hopefully their own ego won't get in the way, and they'll be very good at listening to that.
So in line with that, it's good to, what's the best way to kind of gauge a fit, even up front at first? What are some tools there? I don't know, just what you're looking for.
Yeah, I would, a lot of times therapists will offer free meet and greets, or you can sometimes get a feel for that over the phone, even in a conversation. Depends. If after 3 sessions you're not feeling it, if it doesn't seem to be helping, if you're feeling worse than when you started after 3 sessions, that is not a good sign. And it's not that I have people say, well, therapists just tell you what you want to hear. No. If that were true, I wouldn't have people be upset with me on occasion. It's not that they're gonna tell you what you want to hear necessarily, but you want to balance really feeling heard. And if you don't feel validated or heard by your therapist, that is not a good sign. And I would give it 3 sessions at the most. A lot of times you'll know that before. Part of why I offer the free meet and greets is because young people will, I tell the parents, if your teenager doesn't like me, it's not going to work. And so when you're working as a family or individually or with a young person, you really want their buy-in into the process, which means you kind of have to like the therapist.
Right. Yeah, that's true. We had when we were talking, we had a really interesting talk regarding how the church, and obviously we're trying to do some stuff in talking about it, but how can the church do a better job supporting people with mental health, pushing people towards counseling? What are just some ways, if you could dream, I guess, what's like the ultimate when it comes to the church helping in this area?
I really appreciate churches like yours. I really appreciate what you're doing now. I think this is a good example of how churches can help support that. One of the churches that I've attended, I would say at least once a month, pastoral staff with whatever the issue was would say, hey, if you're really struggling in this issue, whether it be anger or depression or anxiety, seek some help. Like if this is a problem for you, if you're having problems in your relationships ongoing, and that encouragement continually was really helps take the stigma out of it. I've had pastoral staff share that they have seen therapists. I think that's amazing when they do that. I think that's so brave for them to do it. Even as therapists, there is a stigma. Therapists don't want to admit if they're seeing a therapist. So there is some of that. So I really appreciate when pastors do that, as I know you have done. I really appreciate when churches have support groups. I was looking at the bulletin connection points that you have, and you've got a lot of good places to connect for help for people. To be able to talk about these things means it's able to be managed. And that's kind of a quote from Mr. Rogers, but he would say he's a great guy. If feelings are mentionable, then they're manageable. And we have to be able to have conversations around that.
Good. So one thing I might mention is that you'll see a phone number up here every once in a while. Don't give it out. It's mine. Right. I know what I just did, so it's okay. But text in some questions if you have them. We're gonna try to answer some live questions as well. This one kind of pertains to it. I'm going to assume what they mean by it. They said, how should the church approach mental illness that is overwhelming? So I'm assuming this is some areas of mental health that are that lash out in certain ways. Mm-hmm. So what would be maybe even when people are acting out in service or in the community, what is the best way to approach that?
Mm-hmm. I have a couple thoughts with that. My first thought is safety. Sometimes when people are struggling with mental health issues, it might be a co-occurring issue of substance abuse. And so sometimes we just want to make sure that everybody's staying safe. And so I know some churches have different policies on like, okay, these ushers are just going to keep an eye on how things are going and help. But also, most violent crimes are not done by mentally ill people. And so when things are overwhelming, don't be afraid to ask for help. I think that would be my biggest recommendation. It can be really discouraging, and in the process of me being a foster mom, I had this happen to me, but it can be really discouraging when the therapist is like, yeah, you're too much for me. And so to be able to refer, to say, I can't help you, but I know some specialists who can help manage this issue. And so when the church is able to find specialists or refer to, I know His Heart Foundation with Angela is really good for that. Yeah. And I was listening to some of the sermons that you've done in the series, and you hit on a lot of those good points about listening. Validation is really big when things are overwhelming. Sometimes it can be just a stress reliever to have someone say, I get that you're feeling how you're feeling, and that's okay. If we aren't able to give people permission to feel how they're already feeling, it escalates the issue. But if they are overwhelming, when they are overwhelming, because that all happens to some of us at some point in our life, just really don't be afraid to ask for help.
Good. That's good. Along those lines, in that particular message, I was talking about, and this came out of a conversation we had, about the difference between supporting someone with mental illness and enabling someone with mental illness. And so what are some of what do we look for there? Like, how do we, because that's a really hard line to differentiate between. What are some ways we can see that differently?
It's like a tightrope when you're walking it, and I'm thinking from a parent perspective as well. You don't want to enable your kids, but you do want to support them. You want to be able to encourage them, and you guys are as parents, the best ones to know how much is too much. So one of the questions that I often ask people is this sustainable? If the situation that you're in is not sustainable, then it's probably on the enabling side. I'll give you an example. One of the young girls who was in my home had really high anxiety around attending school, had a significant trauma background, and initially I didn't know what she was capable of. But the more I got to know her, the more I realized I think that she can manage school. And so we put some behavioral pieces into place to say, okay, if you need to stay home from school because you're so anxious, that's okay. You can do that. That's not a bad thing. I get that you have anxiety. But just like when you're physically sick, you need to be resting and reading, not on your phone or watching TV or playing video games. And that was enough of an incentive that she didn't miss any more school after that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And with on the other side, with maybe someone who, let's say, is dealing with a bout of depression, when is it too much to pressure them into doing something, allow them to rest if they need to rest? Is there a way to gauge that, or is it just, I know it's case by case because no one's exactly the same, but when to kind of stir somebody up and say, no, we got to do this together, or when to say, okay, it's okay, you obviously need some time?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is very individualized. One of the things that you might look at is if you notice that you are over-functioning and if the other person is under-functioning. And families can maintain that for a season. We have to, if someone is disabled, if someone is sick. But if you notice that you are continually over-functioning and there's no end in sight and there's no hope and there's no support being met, then it might be time to say, hey, this isn't working. Kind of goes back to that sustainability. This isn't going to last. I'm concerned about the longer-term effects on our marriage or on our family or our friendship. I know that I've had a friend, ironically also a therapist, who was really struggling with grief and bitterness. And at one point, and months go by, and I'm continuing to hear about it, and I can see it affecting her work, and I can see it affecting our relationship. And so I had to say, hey, I'm really thinking it would be helpful if you saw someone, because I'm not seeing this change. And some progress, some work needs to be kind of addressed on this because I care about you, because I want our relationship to continue and work well.
So that was kind of a case of you're letting someone vent to you or be a friend, but realizing you need more than this.
Yeah.
So okay. Yeah, that's really important. What when it comes to this issue, specifically in the youth spectrum, so that we're aware, what are the youth dealing with these? Because I know it's a lot different.
It's so much different. So I've been in the field 12 years, and it has shifted drastically because what's changed in the last 12 years? These. My first smartphone was when I was a therapist. It was when I was a therapist. So, and I don't want to blame all mental health issues on phones. I don't think that's fair in any way, shape, or form. And I love my iPhone. So it is a very different culture, though. And what we're noticing with young people is that where before, in probably maybe our generation, young people were getting in trouble like crashing cars and doing stupid things outside of the house. Now it has shifted, and there isn't very much of that anymore, but there's a lot more isolation. There's a lot more loneliness. There's a lot more rates of suicide that are spiking in that. And, as an adult with a fully formed brain, it is hard for me sometimes to manage the electronics in my life. And with young people who do not have that frontal cortex fully developed, the impulse control of just grabbing it and reaching it, and then the anxiety links that come with it can be very difficult. And then you add in social media, which I so am, I'm on Facebook and I have an Instagram. It's not like I'm anti-social media by any means, but when you're comparing your life to others, one study said it's not even social media that's the issue, it's what you're doing on it. Are you comparing your life to others? Are you looking to see how many likes you get? And the young people have this pressure. If you were bullied in school when you were younger, you could go home and get away from it. You can't do that anymore. So the level of mental health issues for young people right now, I read one study and it said if young people had the level of stress that they have now back in the 1950s, they would have hospitalized them. Wow. So most of our young people are dealing with a significant amount of stress, and so to definitely being aware of that, yeah.
How do we advocate for them in that? What can we do?
Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of conversations. I have, there are a lot of helpers in this area. There's a website called Screenagers. It's on Facebook, and I see it come up a lot. And they talk about just having open conversations every week as a family. Another one of my pet peeves is when we blame the teenager for being on their phone all the time, and you look over at the parents and they're on their phone all the time. So it's not a teenage issue. It's really a family issue. And to be able to figure out how to maintain boundaries around it that are realistic and sustainable, and hearing people's needs, because maybe it is really important to take a video of the Christmas tree, even though you're trying to have family time and want the phones away, and trying to just listen to what's going on and what your young person is needing. And if they're asking for help, getting them that, knowing that there's no shame in that. I really appreciate it when young people can ask for help, and it really saddens me when sometimes parents are like, oh, you're okay, not minimizing the issue. And this is especially true for young men. Young men don't tend to seek therapy at all. That's why I'm a teenage therapist who specializes in teenage girls who engage in self-harm. And I do see young boys, but at times as well, or young men. But the ratio, young men tend to come in for anger, and teenage girls tend to come in for anxiety and depression. Okay. Yeah.
Before we move on to another one, I'm wondering. We talked a little bit about this. There's an outrageous statistic with LGBTQ specifically.
Yeah, that's true.
And I remember when you mentioned it, I was floored. But more than just floored by the statistic were the reasons behind the statistic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So right now in our culture, in the LGBTQ community, both historically and currently, sometimes the church is not very good about offering hope. And so the rates of depression and suicide for young people in that community are astronomical. It goes way up. And part of that reason is because of the lack of acceptance. And in the church, that number is higher, not lower, because we're not doing a good job as a church at loving on them. And this is a very broad generalization. I'm not saying your church, but oftentimes when young people come out to their very conservative Christian families, they will get kicked out of their homes. They will be called names. One of the foster young girls who came into my home, her parents were conservative Christians. That's the first time she'd been to church, was with one of her step-parents, and called her horrible names, told her she's going to hell, and a very cruel environment. And it's a hard thing for families in general to go through, but if as a young person, if you don't have the support of at least one adult, it's very hopeless. And as a church, if we can't offer them hope, we are not doing our job. We have to be able to offer them hope.
That's good. I have a question here. What about a spouse or loved one who has mental illness but is too afraid to talk to a counselor? It's a good way to go about that.
It's really hard. Pray a lot, because sometimes God can move in ways that we can't. Sometimes having boundaries is appropriate, on saying, I would say start with that validation and really hearing them. Recognize what that fear is. Sometimes it's fear of a diagnosis being put on them, which I totally get. Sometimes people will say, well, they don't want someone to say there's something wrong with them, or they think they're the problem. And so really being able to hear and listen to what their fears are around that is a really helpful place to begin. And sometimes it might be helpful for you to go to therapy, to have a counselor saying, hey, this is what you can do with your spouse or family member or friend who won't get help. And they can kind of guide you on things to say and boundaries that you might want to put in place to just protect your own self, because it does take a toll on the relationship.
Yeah. I was thinking about Jesus at the pool of Bethesda, and the man who he asked, do you want to get well? And a lot of times I think I've skipped over that, just thinking like, well, that's kind of a stupid question. Like, of course I want to get well. But I wonder how many times that's a real question. Like, are you not even are you ready to get well, but do you really want to seek help in this arena? What are some ways to help people who are not ready, or who would answer that question, no, I don't want to get well?
It's a really good, honest question. I've had to ask it with clients before too. You would assume if they're coming to see a therapist, they might want something different, but that's not always the case. Sometimes change is really hard, and sometimes the way that our brains are wired, we're comfortable being miserable. It's familiar to us, especially if you were raised in a really chaotic family environment. It is going to be very difficult for your brain to be okay with quiet and peace and calmness. And so getting that help might not even feel realistic. Like, why? That it feels uncomfortable to be healthier. So your question was, what can we do with that? Okay, a piece of it. Be honest about it. I think it's really helpful if we know, okay, you're not ready to change, or you're not in a place where you're wanting to get help, and kind of acknowledging that, but also being really clear on how much you're willing to do and what you're not willing to do. Because just because they're not willing to change doesn't mean you have to continue to function how you're functioning.
So some boundaries in that. Yeah. I'm also thinking about just my own personal story. So this last Friday was my intake, and it was a great session.
Good.
One of the things that is interesting in that is sometimes you don't know what to expect going in. I found myself even having a high level of anxiety, even walking into the place.
Yes.
Which, I don't necessarily always struggle with anxiety like that, but I did have it.
I think a therapist will do it to you.
Yeah, that's true. So letting you know. But I guess, how do we walk alongside people in that?
Go with them to the appointment.
Okay. Yeah.
If they want someone to go with them, offer to go with them. It is very anxiety provoking to see a therapist. I think through the last 15 years, I've probably, in the course of either being a mom or for my own help, met at least 8 different therapists, and my own anxiety was high. The first time was definitely anxiety provoking, because you're like, what are they? Are they going to make me cry? Can they read my mind? What are they going to say? If they ask you something you don't want to answer, tell them that. You don't have to answer. I try to make therapy especially for young people too, because they don't know what this adult's going to do or say, to be able to as a friend, offer to go with them. But I like hot drinks. I think you should take a hot drink with you when you go to therapy. I always offer tea, cocoa, cider, and chai to clients because I really want them to be able to have a sense of grounding to release anxiety. If you're drinking something, it's soothing in itself. So it's just a practical piece of it.
That's why I have this up here with me right now.
See, I'm too anxious to even open mine. I get real practical in the office. I have fidget toys for my young people to do with, and the adults love them too. Balloons, I carry balloons oftentimes around because it's a grounding technique. If with anxiety, just going into that first appointment can be really stressful. Sucking on something can be helpful. Sometimes people will have peppermints, or I have intentionally have things to suck on in my office, candies, just to kind of lower that level of reactivity because it is a stressful environment. And when I have been to therapy, sometimes, not always, but it's exhausting. It's not easy talking about certain things or realizing that you have to change some things or that you're going to have to implement some of these boundaries. Sometimes therapists will tell you to do things. You're like, I have no idea how to do that. So it's show me how to do that and help me figure it out. And then a lot of brain power and energy around it. And so it's kind of like working out, which is great because we're at the Y. But, you get really tired after a workout. Sometimes you need to rest. And that's true for therapy too, because you need to be able to, after a therapy session, rest. I've had a therapy session and then I'm supposed to go to work and do therapy. That does not work well. I've realized that I need to put some of my own boundaries in place and do those on separate days because emotionally I need some recovery time if I'm going to go be the therapist.
Yeah, so piggybacking on that, I experienced some of that too. Friends and family, well-meaning, and I know I've done it myself, want to know how it went. And so, and I know that that's going to be it's a natural thing to want to care, right? Like, how did it go? How long should you wait before you ask that question? What are, maybe like, is there a tactic around that as far as being a friend who's supporting somebody? Do we ask right away? Do we ask after a while? Do we ask?
I think we ask because we care. Young people really get cranky sometimes with it. They don't want to share anything about their therapy experience with their parents sometimes. Others don't care. It depends on your young person. I'm wondering if the question, and I think it does vary from person to person. If someone asks me, I don't mind answering. It's real. This is what we talked about in general, and then it's up to me to decide how deep I want to go with that or not. But I'm a really open person, and I have many family members and friends who are not that way. I'm wondering if asking the question, is there anything that I should know about it? Anything you want me to know about it? Nope. Okay, good to go.
Yeah.
Or, we talked about this. And so that kind of gives them an option to open up the conversation. And sometimes the question, how did it go? It went good. I cried and we talked about painful things. Like, how do you answer that? Like, it's kind of a hard question to answer. So.
Right. No, that's so true. I think just kind of coming back to the church at large, if there was anything you could say to us, just from you to us as a mental health specialist, how can the church just get better?
I think the pieces that would be most helpful is if we can take the idea that mental health issues are sinful and just get rid of it. The verse that comes in my mind is, do not be anxious about anything. And just that piece of the verse, I get anxious about feeling anxious. Oh no, I'm sinning. I'm doing something wrong. And that's not, if you're really looking into the passages, that's how we're talking about it. It's not a sin to have feelings. What we do with them can be, depending what we do with them. But a lot of people will question, if I'm depressed, maybe my spiritual health isn't really that good. Maybe I'm not listening to God, or I've got sin in my life or something along those lines. And that's not true. I mean, if you look at Scripture really, if you really look at it, there's some really depressed people in the Bible. And to be able to say that through David, for example, his failures, and I'm not meaning mental health issues, but his actual failures that then led to depression, he learned so much from them. And it's so encouraging for us. You shared, I think it was, I don't know if it was the last week or the week before, but how God can use our experiences to help others. And I get so much comfort from David's stuff. It puts a lot less pressure on me because it gives me permission to just be human, to be anxious, to be depressed, to mess up. There should really taking the shame piece away from needing help.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good. Anything else you want to say to us?
Thank you so much for doing this.
You're welcome.
I am so excited about this. I think it's a really good thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being here and agreeing to do this. And
Absolutely.
I know this isn't like your favorite thing to sit in front of a group of people and talk, but thanks for doing it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, appreciate you.
My pleasure.
So would you give her a hand? You can take your water. I'm really encouraged by, I think, everything within this series, and just hearing the stories of those of you who are struggling, sending those things to me. Thank you for being open, for those of you who were vulnerable and honest throughout this series. It doesn't end here. Again, we have the option of telling our story. Like that's a powerful tool. Telling our personal story is a powerful tool, not only in our own lives, getting something out, but also in the lives of other people. It can do so much. If you tell your story, someone can say, yeah, I'm dealing with that too. That whole Me Too thing is so real that we can actually feel like somebody is living part of our story. It was interesting. I wanted to end this way, that Caleb actually, this happened a couple times now with you and me. It wasn't planned either. He read from Isaiah 9, or he recited Isaiah 9, I should say. And it's a beautiful piece of scripture that foretells the coming of Jesus. And I'll just read it again just real quick. I should probably, okay. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us, the government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called, and I love this, especially in context of what we're talking about, Wonderful Counselor. Know that God can handle you saying whatever it is that's on your mind, because guess what? He already knows what's on your mind and on your heart. And for you to be able to verbalize that to him, I think it honors him. He loves it when we're open to him, when we open our hearts to him. He's the wonderful counselor. And what I love in context of this is mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. His government and its peace will never end. And that word peace is the word shalom, which we've talked about before, which is wholeness. It's not just a settled feeling within, which is what we think peace is. That's what we go to when we think peace. We think, oh, I have anxiety, I need some peace, I need to take a deep breath, and peace will enter, right? It's way more than that. When we say Jesus is the Prince of Peace, he's the Prince of wholeness, bringing wholeness. And that is part of our journey through mental health, is helping people find hope where they can go to ultimately the wonderful counselor, right? Who will provide wholeness. And he's also provided wonderful counselors in our lives to help us on that journey. Don't be afraid of it. Go. If you need help, go seek counseling. It is so important for our journey to talk about these things. Real quick, I want to pray for you, but I also want to encourage you. There's a few ways you can that we can move forward. Number one, if you look at the worship folder on the seat next to you, there's a long pamphlet there. It's a resource card for you. And it has all the not all the resources, but the important resources around this topic. We will have this indefinitely, and we'll probably add to it as it goes. But this is all of the different things that can help you on your journey wherever you're at in it. There's ways that you can, if you're dealing with addiction, there are groups for you for that. There's, again, counseling referral through His Heart Foundation. There's a lot of resources on there, a lot of small groups, again, our life groups, ways to do life together, to get in and start talking about this stuff and really making it part of the way that we work here at Rhapsody, is supporting each other and helping each other through this stuff. So take that resource with you. You can post it on your fridge if you need it for a friend, if you need it for yourself. If you, again, helping refer people to specialists. I love that part of the conversation. That the worst thing you can do is offer somebody advice about something you have no idea about. It really is. Because then the person who's the specialist has to undo so much in order to get to the thing that they specialize in. So let's be masters at referring people to who they really need to talk to. Let's become really, really good at that, okay? Can we do that? Just become really, really good at that, referring people to who they need to go to. And another thing that you can do is you can tell your story around this. We've had, last week we had the video camera set up. Alex agreed to do that again this week. And again, if you're comfortable, if you're ready, tell your story. I guarantee you it will do something in your own heart to tell your story. But the amount of people that it helps, you'll never know. You'll never know the reach that story goes to, how far it goes, I should say. You just will never know. And so getting that out there is a huge, huge thing. So would you close your eyes for a minute? And I think it's appropriate just to end our series this way. We talked at the very beginning about those of you who maybe throughout have thought about what we called showing your hand, which came from the idea that many of us are trying to hide the pain and the stuff that we're going through behind our backs. And what God wants for us is to be a part of a safe community where we can begin to show our hands and say, this is what I'm dealing with, and I need help and I need support. And so eyes are closed around the room, but just for your sake and between you and God and me, if you are comfortable, maybe through this 4-week journey, you're just now at a place where you want to say, that's me, and I need some prayer. I want to give you a chance to do that right now. If that's you, would you just lift your hand in the air? Yeah. And again, I'll continue to raise my hand because I continue to need help from this community and continue to need support. Jesus, I pray for those who have raised their hand today. And I ask that you would meet them with support from you, the wonderful counselor, but that you would also meet their needs in this community. That you'd surround them with people who love them, that they would know that they're safe, that they would know that they belong here, and they would know that there's hope within this community. I pray that you'd give them peace, wholeness, that you'd heal their hearts, heal their minds. In Jesus' name, amen. And God, I pray for all of us, that we could be a community that's safe, that we could support people, that we could be a place where people feel like they belong, and ultimately where people begin to find hope in you as we walk as a community together in this stuff. We love you so much. We're grateful that you are the wonderful counselor, that you identify with our weakness, that you felt what we feel. It's why you can sympathize with us. Such a beautiful thing. We love you so much. In Jesus' name, amen.